Welcome, beloved, to A Mystic in Christ. This podcast is here to help you remember yourself as one beloved of God. Each word is offered to help you feel how deeply seen, held, and chosen you truly are. Because in reality, nothing stands between you and the presence of love. Only a thin veil of forgetting. May these moments together be a bridge to remembrance, lifting the veil and carrying you home into the arms of love you never left. I'm your host, Neriya, and together we listen for what love wants to say. So let's dive into today's episode. There's a cryptic prophecy once spoken by a man who willingly walked into the flames of the Inquisition. He said, "At the end of 700 years, the laurel will turn green again." Now, this prophecy found me without me going looking for it. Up until recently, I'd never heard these words before. But then, within a matter of weeks, it suddenly came up again and again in conversation with friends. And each time it was mentioned, I experienced strong bodily sensations. There were goosebumps, and then tears welled up in my eyes. And before I even understood what it meant, I just felt that my soul was trying to communicate something to me. As if she was saying, "Pay attention. This is no coincidence." So I kept thinking about this prophecy and what it means. And as I did my research, I found some really fascinating things I would like to share with you in this episode. And again, this is not just about something that happened in the past. This is very much saying something about now. But to be able to understand it, we're going to travel back in time 700 years, into fire, into loss, and into the story of a spiritual community that was erased by the church. And then we're going to walk back all the way home into this present moment of now, where we'll see what this prophecy means for us today as awakening men and women living in this world. Because I truly believe this prophecy once spoken is not just an ancient relic from history, it is very much alive now, speaking to us from outside of time with a precision that literally makes my breath catch. So, beloved, welcome back to Mystic in Christ, where intimacy is a pathway to the divine. I'm your host, Neriya, and together we listen for what love wants to say. So let's begin. So to understand this prophecy, we first need to understand who spoke it and why his people were destroyed. Let me take you there. It is the 13th century. We are in the hills of what we now call the south of France, a region then known as Languedoc, a landscape of sun, vineyards, and troubadour songs, where an extraordinary spiritual community is quietly alive and thriving. They call themselves simply les bons hommes et bonnes femmes, the good men and the good women. The world, including the church, calls them the Cathars. That name comes from the Greek word Catharos. It means pure. Because pure is exactly what they were, and not in some kind of rigid, self-punishing sense that was so often associated with medieval Christianity, but pure in the sense of devotion. They were pure in heart. They lived with a burning love for God that did not require a pope, or indulgences purchased with coins, which is much of what the Catholic Church had become during that time. They lived a radical simplicity. They were Gnostics. They believed that within every human soul lives a divine spark, a fragment of the God of light, temporarily closed in matter. This material world, in their theology, was not actually God's greatest creation, but a sort of exile, a realm of forgetting our divinity, where we veiled ourselves, hiding our true light. So the entire spiritual path is literally an act of divine remembrance, of turning inwards, of finding that sacred inner flame and following it all the way back home. Now, to me, that doesn't sound that heretical if you consider that Yeshua, in the original Aramaic prayer, which is now today known as the Lord's Prayer, taught, it begins with, O birther, mother, father, God. And then later there's a line that says, do not let us enter forgetfulness, but free us from unripeness. So again, this theme of forgetting and remembering. And for more on the Aramaic Jesus, I recommend that you explore the books of Dr. Neil Douglas Klotz. He's excellent at that. But anyway, back to the Cathars. What they really taught was something called gnosis, from the Greek word for knowing. And not knowing as like more information, but direct, intimate communion with the divine. They knew that you can know God from within. You don't need anyone standing between you and the holy. And this is the same kind of mystical knowing that produced the texts discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945. They included the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and, as I mentioned in another episode earlier, the Thunder, Perfect Mind, with its extraordinary voice of Sophia, the divine feminine, as she's speaking in paradoxes from the heart of creation. And the episode I'm referring to is called Blessed Virgin or Holy Whore, if you want to check that out. Now, the Cathars were part of this mystical stream, a stream that had been flowing underground for centuries, quietly persisting in communities of mystics and Gnostics all across the Mediterranean world, and now shimmering here in the golden hills of Languedoc. Now here's what made them really revolutionary for that time, and I think ultimately unbearable to Rome. They ordained women. Women were initiated as parfaits, the female perfects, the highest level of Cathar spiritual life. They stood on exact equal terms with men. Now imagine in the 13th century in medieval Europe, women had been systematically stripped of their spiritual authority for nearly 1,000 years or more. And Eve was blamed for the fall. Mary Magdalene had been turned into a penitent prostitute. And all along, the Cathars looked at women and said, the divine flame burns just as brightly in her. She, too, is a vessel of the sacred. She can teach, heal, initiate, and lead. Yeah, they honored both the masculine and the feminine aspect of the divine. And they flourished all across Languedoc and the south of France, in the villages and even in castles of sympathetic nobles and in the open countryside. Their faith was spreading. And this is exactly what made them dangerous to the powers that be. Christianity that doesn't need Rome was an existential threat to the Roman Catholic Church. A faith that said every soul has direct access to the divine without priests or indulgences or papal authority is not a heresy to be corrected, but a power to be obliterated. So in 1219, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade. I kind of wonder why someone like that could be called Pope Innocent, but that's for another conversation. This crusade that he initiated was named after the town of Albi, which was a stronghold of the Cathars. Now, this is what makes this moment really, really shocking and staggering, because this Albigensian crusade was the first ever crusade directed not against Muslims in the Holy Land, but against fellow Christians fought on European soil. This was the first time ever the Church of Rome promised salvation for killing other Christians. So anyway, some genocide scholars have described the Albigensian Crusade as the first ideological genocide. It was a campaign designed not just to defeat an enemy, but to erase an entire way of being, a way of knowing and living. The Church's crusading armies swept through Languedoc in ways of extraordinary violence. At the city of Béziers in the first terrible year of 1219, when the soldiers asked the papal legate how to tell the Cathar heretics from the good Catholics in the population, the Pope was said to have answered, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Now, we don't know if he said those exact words or not, but the massacre was real and thousands were killed in a single day. So the military phase of the Albigensian Crusade went on for 20 years, from 1219 to 1229. And after that, it wasn't over. Something even more insidious came. The Inquisition. The systematic hunting down of the survivors. The inquisitors went from door to door, from village to village, and neighbor was turned against neighbor. Confessions were extracted under conditions we don't need to specify to understand. And always, always, the burnings. The culmination of this insanity came at Montségur. Montségur is a fortress perched on a dramatic rocky peak in the Pyrenees. It was the last great refuge of the Cathar community, high above the Languedoc plains. After a siege of almost 10 months, the Cathars finally surrendered. Now the Crusaders offered mercy. All who would recant, who would say, "Okay, I was wrong, I renounced this heresy," would be spared. However, all of the 224 Cathars staying at this fortress refused. So on March 16, 1244, men, women and children were brought down to the foot of the mountain where a massive pyre had been prepared. And they, the Cathars, walked willingly into the flames, singing even by some accounts. Now let's pause here for a moment just to digest the immense cruelty of what was happening, and also the deeper mystical understanding of why weren't they afraid to walk into the fire? What did they carry inside that made them unafraid of death? If you imagine that the institutional church had built its entire power structure around fear of death, fear of divine punishment and hellfire, fear of the body and the feminine, fear of God and his wrath. Fear was the only instrument of control, and yet there were over 200 people to whom this didn't apply. They knew something deep inside their bones and in the divine flame that was burning at the center of their chest. They knew what Yeshua himself taught in his deeper, more hidden teachings, that death has no sting because life is eternal. They knew that the great I Am presence, which is dwelling within every soul, which is sometimes also described as the Sophia presence, the divine spark, or the Christ within, was never born and will never die. What we call death in our world is simply the end of one form, but not the extinction of the life that is eternal and has wrapped itself in the form like a mantle. So the bodies standing before the flames were not who these people really are. They knew this in the way you know your own name. So they walked into the fire freely, with their inner knowing intact, carrying an inner flame that no pyre could ever touch. I still marvel at their bravery and at the cruelty and brutality of all of this. And just when you think, okay, now we can breathe out, that this is it, finally, peace. No, the months ago was not the end. The Inquisition continued to hunt them still. For decades it combed the mountains and villages of Languedoc. And we know this in detail because there was one document, the Fournier Register, which describes everything in meticulous detail. This bishop, called Jacques Fournier of Pamiers, interrogated the last surviving Cathar communities in the early 14th century. He was so rough in his persecution of heretics that he later rose through the church ranks to become Pope Benedict XII. So, yeah, his records, by the grim irony of history, are now among our richest sources for understanding the very people he erased. So, by 1321, all his hard work had finally come to completion. 77 years after Montségur, the only one known last prophet remained alive. Only one. And his name was Guilhelm Belibast. Eventually he too was betrayed, captured and brought to the stakes. Burned alive. The last initiated spiritual leader of the Cathar movement, burned like all the others before him. But in his final moments, just before the flames took him, he spoke again. And that's the prophecy. At the end of 700 years, the laurel will turn green again, and the good women and men will return. 700 years from that day in 1321. That is 2021 and onward, now. Before we explore what this means for us today, let us uncover the hidden layers of this prophecy, because there are more than one meaning layers. It's like many mystical utterances, multi-layered, and each layer is a gift. So let's unwrap each one slowly and reverently. Let's begin with the laurel. In Greek mythology, there's a story of a young woman named Daphne. Daphne is the daughter of a river god known Peneus. Daphne was stricken by Cupid's arrow, but not in a good way. She was made averse to love, and the infatuated solar god Apollo was struck with a golden arrow, so he fell madly in love with her and pursued her with an obsession that was bordering on possession. He wanted to capture her gifts and own her essence and make her his. But Daphne refused. So she ran away from him and then called out to her father, the river god, for transformation and for help. And in the nick of time, she is indeed transformed into a laurel tree. She became something that the dominating male principle, Apollo in this case, could never fully possess. He could crown himself with her leaves, which he did, but he could not be with her in the way he wanted to. Even though the laurel wreath is still a symbol of male glory, victory, and conquest to this day. Nevertheless, the life that was Daphne's did not end. It simply transfigured. So this is the first meaning layer within the Cathar prophecy. When a power that cannot tolerate pure feminine wisdom comes after her, she doesn't perish, she shapeshifts. Just like the Gnostic spiritualities went underground, their texts got buried in the desert at Nagamadi, and like the Red Magdalene thread was pushed to the margins of the official Christ story and her true order went underground, they didn't die, they simply waited. And now they're resurfacing. They're greening again, just like the laurel that is still alive beneath a long winter. This is also the Gnostic understanding of Sophia, divine wisdom, the feminine face of God. Her exile from the center of our spiritual worldview was never really her extinction. It was only her forgetting. However, her true wisdom was never absent from this world. She was alive in the women who walked into the fire at Mount Segura, alive in all the mystics and so-called heretics of every tradition, alive in every woman who kept quietly and stubbornly knowing things that she had been told she had no right to know. Now here's the next meaning layer, the number 7. In Kabbalah, the great Jewish mystical tradition that threads through and alongside the esoteric Christianity that the Cathars practiced, 7 is the number of completion. It's associated with eternity and the cyclical return. The 7th day is the Shabbat, which is not merely a rest, but the completion of a full cycle of creation before the next cycle can begin. The 700 years, as was spoken in the prophecy, means in the mystical grammar of these traditions not just a very long time, it also indicates the completion of an arc. It describes the full descent through all the layers of forgetting, all the way down into the underworld and the darkness, and then journeying all the way back up to make the circle complete. So Bellybust wasn't saying, just wait long enough and things will get better. He was saying there is a timing to these things, a cosmic rhythm, a cycle of descent and ascent, as reliable as the seasons. And we are in it now. The cycle has completed. Now here's something exciting, that is the third meaning layer. The laurel was also the sacred plant medicine of the Pythia, the high priestess and oracle of the temple of Apollo at Delphi. This priestess would chew on laurel leaves and also burn them as incense and inhale those scents to let divine wisdom move through her body, allowing the inner knowing from the divine to arise through her flesh, her breath, and her voice. Long before Apollo claimed the Delphic oracle as his own, it belonged to Mama Gaia, the primordial Greek earth goddess, the oldest oracle and the overseer of the oracle at Delphi. Gaia represented the deepest knowing that comes directly from the body of the earth. So the laurel turning green again is also a prophecy about this way of inner knowing, a body-based, intuitive, feminine, visionary, and rooted in direct experience kind of knowing, rather than one that comes from mere outside information or doctrinal authority. After Christianity became Rome's state religion, the oracle at Delphi was shut down because it was condemned as pagan, and with that the last oracle was silenced. But this earth-based, embodied, womb wisdom way of knowing is returning now. There's one more thing I want to talk about when it comes to this prophecy, and that is this. He said, the good men and women will return in 700 years. The Cathars were one of the only movements in medieval Europe that ordained women as spiritual equals. Again, they lived the Christianity of co-equal partnership. So again, Balabasta's final words were predicting the restoration of a world where masculine and feminine principles are honored as co-equal sacred partners, seeing eye to eye, where neither is exiled and neither is more dominant or has power over the other. They share power with each other. So together, they form what Yeshua himself embodied, the radiant union of the divine masculine and the divine feminine within, whole, luminous, and complete. Something is happening in the world right now. Can you feel it? Let's name it, because that in itself is a form of remembrance. I think we can all observe that across traditions, across continents and academic disciplines, healing circles and kitchen tables, something long underground is rising again. Women in the church are asking, where is the Divine Mother in Scripture? Where is she in these texts we were handed and in the ones that were hidden from us? Feminist theologians like Elisabeth Schüssler of Firenze have spent decades discovering the feminine from the marginal texts of the Bible. And scholars like Karen King have worked hard to restore the Gospel of Mary Magdalene to her rightful place as one of the earliest and most sophisticated Christian documents we have. And if you look outside of institutionalized religion, something equally profound is happening. The goddess is returning across a different threshold. Earth-based spiritualities, sacred feminine retreats, mystery school teachings, and proliferation of devotion to Mary Magdalene. And outside of the religious and spiritual communities, there are anthropologists, archaeologists, and historians who have contributed yet another sacred thread. The late Maya Gimbutas spent decades documenting the pre-patriarchal civilizations of old Europe. There were cultures flourishing in the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean 7,000 years ago and beyond, where the goddess was a central sacred image. In these cultures, women held spiritual authority, and the archaeological record shows that there was dramatically less warfare, less violence, and more evidence of what scholar Riane Eisler calls partnership rather than domination. Eisler's landmark book, The Chalice and the Blade, lays this out in full. That the shift from partnership civilizations to dominator civilizations was not inevitable. It was a choice made by the people who wrote history, and it can be remade by us today. Before the blade claimed supremacy, the chalice was held as the primary sacred image. The chalice symbolizes the grail, the womb, the body of the Divine Mother, who gives and sustains life. Psychologists and writers are now naming what many of us experience as ancient mother hunger, a deep and pervasive, almost cellular ache for the mother goddess who was taken from us, wiped out of the official stories by men who wanted to proclaim a male-only God. But our souls ache for wholeness, and so our Divine Mother hunger can be seen everywhere. In Mariam devotion within the Catholic Church, in devotees seeking the goddess in ancient mythologies, or tantric temples, in pilgrims looking for the Black Madonna in shrines and churches of Southern Europe. And then there are those who are meeting her in the wild feminine fire of their own bodies, or in the wombs of women who remember they were once her priestesses. She has always been here, and now she is turning green again. So with that said, I want to get personal for a moment, because this is where the prophecy lands most intimately for me, and perhaps for some of you listening too. And maybe this is why I was crying whenever I heard it. In the past year or so, I've spoken with woman after woman who all describe something similar happening to them in around 2021. A kind of nervous system collapse, a dismantling of something stressful and old that had been held in place for years by sheer force of conditioning. Old patterns that were no longer working. The endless people-pleasing, the performing, the saying yes when the soul was screaming no. The hiding of her fullness to avoid taking up too much space. I think 2021 was the year in which, for many of us, those old structures of self just stopped working. I experienced this in the form of a massive burnout. For a long time, I didn't even really know what to call it. I just felt so tired. And then last year, finally, I heard a whisper from Yeshua in my heart, and he said, with infinite tenderness, love had to undo you completely. And now I am remaking you as a new creation. Something shifted inside of me when I heard his words, because then I understood, okay, this is not just pathology, this is prophecy. What we experience collectively in 2021 and beyond, in our bodies, our nervous systems, in the old structures of the small conditioned self crumbling, that was the laurel losing its deadwood, making space for the new green. I'm also aware that this collective undoing played itself out on a much larger global scale of the COVID-19 pandemic, of course. And even though our personal stories of nervous system collapse had no direct correlation to the health crisis of COVID, maybe our bodies felt those collective tremors too and absorbed them on some level. Who knows, right? We're all connected. Both on an individual scale and on a global scale, I think what began was a collapse of patterns and old shapes that were never quite fully true and not aligned with the soul's deepest knowing. So they had to give way, and not because something was inherently wrong with us, but because something was finally ripe enough for a deeper truth to emerge. Perhaps it's coincidence that this all happened to so many of us in the same time frame. Or perhaps it's a kind of prophecy in itself. But I know how my soul reacted every time I heard this Cathar prophecy. And perhaps you're sensing something right now in your body too as you're listening to my words. Yes, divine feminine energy is rising again. Even though maybe it's not yet part of the mainstream culture, Sophia is returning. However, let's be clear for a moment. Feminine energy is not just a soft, sweet, nurturing, fluffy quality. She is also very fierce and boundary setting, refusing to tolerate half-loves and half-truths. She radically burns away what can no longer hold. Her fire does not argue with the lies. She simply refuses to live inside them anymore. So yeah, she's radical, but she's also sensual and embodied and nature-rooted and ferocious in her love. She is Sophia, she is Magdalene, she is the last parfait who walked into the flames. And she is the energy within your own body that has been waiting for you to remember her. This, for me, is the deepest meaning of the Cathar prophecy. Not that the Cathar religion itself will be reborn, although that is also happening in an underground stream, but what the Cathars actually carried, what made them dangerous enough to be destroyed, is that returning of the direct inner knowing of the divine and the feminine principle in her full dignity and power. Some call this the second coming of Christ. Others call it the Great Awakening, the return of Sophia, or the Age of the Heart. But what it really signifies is the return of co-equal partnership between masculine and feminine in the one body of love. Whatever name you want to give it, it is happening now. And I believe we all have a vital part to play in it. Yeshua once gave some guidance on this one, and I asked him, and he said, the second coming of Christ is the movement of souls coming back into union with each other and with God. It is the realization that love is the answer to every question and the solution to every problem. It is the remembering that we are not alone, that we are one, that the separation from love we once believed in was always an illusion, a forgetting, a dream of exile. The Cathars knew this. They bravely walked into the flames knowing this. And now, 700 years later, the laurel is turning green again. So what do we do with this information now? How do we carry prophecy this vast inside our particular human lives with their obligations and their Monday mornings and their moments of forgetting and again? We start small. We start in the body. You don't have to have understood every word that I said today for what I'm about to offer to land in you. Your body already knows. The goosebumps or the tears, if they came as you listened today, are a kind of recognition. That's the flame of love inside you saying, yes, I remember. I have been waiting for someone to say this out loud. Sophia doesn't need a grand ceremony. She doesn't need you to have a perfect theology or a complete cosmology. She returns in small, deliberate acts of remembrance. She rises again when you stop saying yes, when you actually mean no. When you stop hiding your fullness of your own inner knowing to make others less uncomfortable. And even when you let yourself weep at the prophecy spoken 700 years ago by a man burning in the fire. Because a part of you was there. And a part of him is still here now. And the distance between 1321 and this moment doesn't suddenly feel like much at all anymore. Because what the laurel turning green again really means is this. The divine feminine flame of love never forgot. And neither did you. So let's just take a moment now to anchor everything we've talked about today in our bodies. Because that's where we carry it. So here's a simple practice I want to offer you. In the middle of your day, or whenever you remember, take a moment and just be still. Place a hand on your heart and whisper to the divine flame within you. I'm here, beloved. I remember. And then just take a moment of silence. Just be. And turn your gaze towards the great I Am presence of divine love dwelling within you now. The eternal flame that was never extinguished. The green that was always alive underneath the winter branches. Let yourself be held in this remembrance of who you really are. You don't need to do anything more with it. You don't have to post it on social media to prove it. You can just let it be real and embodied. That's the practice. 30 seconds or as long as you need. This is the laurel turning green again, right now, in the ordinary yet sacred geography of your human heart. So the laurel is turning green again, here, now, in you. I hope this sharing was inspiring for you and helpful. And if you want more individualized one-on-one support to help you navigate your own inner greening during this time of the return of the divine feminine, of Christ, of love, of finding the embodied presence of the divine within, I'm here to support you. I've held space for hours to remember themselves for over 17 years, and I'd love to do the same for you now too. So if you feel called to be supported in sacred mentoring as you navigate the burning fire of your own inner transformation, reach out. I will leave a link for you in the show notes with all the details. And then meet you inside the inner flame of love itself. So now, beloved, let these words seep like warm oil into the old wound that whispers, too much or not enough. Remember, you are never alone. You are eternally held. And if this episode nourished you, please leave a review and subscribe. It helps this podcast grow and reach more hearts ready to remember love. If you wish to drink even deeper, join our community over on Substack for more intimate stories, love-drenched poetry, and sacred fire. You can find us at neriya.substack.com, and I'll also leave a link in the show notes for you. Until next time, may you remember your own sacredness. May you rest in the everlasting arms of love. And may you breathe as one beloved of God.